The self and personality, kind of fascinating. One of the things we're going to talk about, this is chapter 6, by the way. One of the things we're going to talk about is the 20 statements test. The 20 statements test, it's really simple. It's just a survey, and you're supposed to answer these two questions: who am I, and I am. That's all there is, and there are 20 of them, and you have to say who you are and what you are 20 times in 20 different ways. 20 different ways. You need to give them 20 answers. It doesn't take very long. I've done this in my classes before. It only takes a couple minutes. Usually people can't come up with 20 things that they are, but that's okay because that's what the test is all about. It's really kind of fascinating because 20 statements test is it's an open-ended methodology. Um, and people will talk about who they are. Kuhn came up with it in 1960, and what he determined was that there are 5 categories that most people group themselves in. Uh, One, they group themselves in social groups and classifications. You know, I'm a Navajo. um, I'm a member of the Rotary Club. You know, that's the social groups that they belong to. I'm a Presbyterian, whatever. Your ideological beliefs. I'm a Christian. I'm a Muslim. I'm a Buddhist. Their interests. I'm a golfer. I'm a rugby player. Their ambitions. I would like to be a. I am desiring to be a chef. I'm desiring to be a psychologist. And self-evaluations. I'm handsome. I'm tall. I have big feet. Whatever. That's a self-evaluation. That's normally what people will say about themselves. And there you go. 20 questions test. 20 statements test about yourself. And of course, what they discovered was that it varies widely. And it's really kind of amazing because people from the United States say one thing, people from Africa say another thing, people from Asia say another thing, people from Iceland say another thing. Americans most often mention their personal traits or attitudes and their abilities, which accounted for about 48% of their self-description. The American pattern is similar to almost all of the weird people around the world. Australia, Britain, Sweden, Canada. We all identify ourselves by who we think we are and what we think we are. We're pretty, we're tall, we're tanned, we make fish faces when we want to kiss people. When other cultural groups were given the same measure, the results are very much different. The Maasai and Samburu of Kenya had only 2% of their self-descriptions reflect their personal characteristics. I'm tall, I'm slender, whatever. 60% of their descriptions encompass their social membership and their roles. I'm a Maasai, I'm a Samburu, I guard the cattle, whatever. 60% of them were the social membership, whereas Americans and Swedes and Brits and Canadians talked about themselves about 48% of the time. The Maasai and Samburu pattern of a greater emphasis on roles and memberships appears in cultures from much of the rest of the world, and these cultural differences are already evident among kindergarten children, the Cook Islanders, the Malaysians, the Chinese, Native Americans, other Africans besides Kenyans, Puerto Ricans, people from India, people from Japan, even kindergarten people. And these are kindergarten people from the Cook Islands. I thought you would be interested in what Cook Islanders look like. That's what they look like. A Danish study by Ma et al. In 2012 looked at functional MRIs, which of course show which area of the brain lights up when you're doing when you're thinking. They did functional MRIs when participants were evaluating personal characteristics. Now, Ma is kind of an interesting name. This has two meanings. If you say it with one inflection, it means that it's your mother. And if you say it with another inflection, it means mule, as interesting as that is. But it's Chinese. And the Chinese use inflection to show what word they're talking about. And they usually do this with all their words. They use inflection to tell people what they really mean. The Danish participants showed no difference in their functional MRIs when they considered their social roles or their personal characteristics. Both involve the medial prefrontal cortex, which is typically activated in self-judgments. When the researchers performed the same functional MRIs on Chinese participants, their medial prefrontal cortex was only activated when they were considering personal characteristics. When the Chinese thought of their social roles, the temporal parietal function was activated. This is a region that more typically is involved in understanding other people's beliefs. This is the temporal parietal junction right here. That's not it. Now that's it right there. This is the prefrontal cortex right here in the front. Ma et al. In 2012 suggested that Chinese participants were more likely thinking about other people's beliefs when they thought about their social roles. Though we are all individuals, humans are also a highly social species. Social interaction is a continuous balancing act between focusing on our differences and seeking our connection with others. And if you look at this picture and you think that all these people look alike, they actually are exactly the same person. What this individual did, he took his face and he put it on all these people in this picture so that they all look alike. Marcus and Kitayama first identified the independent view of the self in 1991. Independent individuals experience their identities as largely distinct from their relationships. Independent individuals are self-defining. Attitudes, personality traits, preferences, opinions, abilities, individual qualities. That's independent individuals will talk about themselves just like this. Just like all these words on this. OCD, she's OCD. Daughter, God, born, sister, thy, love, strong. Really? The self-experiences are rather stable and does not change much from situation to situation. The independent view of self is experienced as self-contained and exists as a relatively coherent and inviolate entity. Relationships vary and are fluid as individuals tend to be closer to close relations than distant ones, which makes a lot of sense. You're closer to the people you're closer to than the people that are far away. Individuals with independent identity still feel much closer to in-groups than out-group members. However, they do not view them in fundamentally distinct ways. The main bifurcation is between self and non-self, and both in-group and out-group members are non-selves. Marcus and Kitayama in 1991 also identified the interdependent self. The self overlaps quite a bit with an individual's significant relationships. Interdependent individuals are closely connected with others and are not experienced as distinct, unique entities. Interdependent entities are grounded in their relationships with others. That's why they are interdependent, because their relationships are so important. Relationships come in a variety of forms, and they require people to take on particular roles such as father, student, friend, lover, and daughter. And when they think of themselves as a father, student, friend, lover, or daughter, they think of themselves in different roles. This governs how they feel and behave toward their relationship partners, and they will behave differently with each individual. So as somebody's daughter, when you're around your parents, you're going to act differently than if you are a parent to somebody else when you're around your children. The identity of the interdependent individual is experienced as somewhat fluid in different situations. Depending on the situation and the role the person occupies in that situation, the person's experience of their self will vary accordingly. So you act differently around different people. And I just gave you an example of being a parent and being around your parents. Totally different. Relationships with one's in-group members are self-defining for those with interdependent selves. Thus, the people in the in-group assume considerable importance. People do not easily become in-group members, nor do close relationships easily dissipate into out-group relations. So if somebody's in your in-group, it's difficult for them to skew into being an out-group person. This is why it's so difficult to reject somebody who's in your in-group. You can't just switch roles automatically. This is why if you're a member of the Democrat Party or the Republican Party, it's really difficult for you to say, yeah. If you're a Republican, it's really hard for you to say, yeah, Joe Biden's really good. He's a really good president. And if you're a Democrat, it's really hard for you to say, yeah, Trump was right almost all the time, because that would be switching from being an in-grouper to an out-grouper. In 2007, Zhu, Zhang, Fan, and Han conducted an interesting functional MRI experiment on Western and Chinese participants. They asked the participants whether select trait adjectives characterized themselves or their mothers. Kind, giving, adjectives. Pretty. Westerners show different regions of the brain activation, suggesting that they represent themselves and their mothers in distinct ways. Your mother is one entity and you are somebody else. Now remember, Westerners are individualists, but the Chinese, on the other hand, are collectivists. Therefore, when they thought of themselves and their mothers, they showed activation patterns in the same regions of for the two tasks, the medial prefrontal cortex. This is an area that's linked with your own self-representation. So when you think of your mother, you're thinking of an extension of yourself. So it occupies the same region of your brain. So you don't think of your mother as independent of you, you think of her as part of you, and you think of you as part of her. Independent selves have a number of close relationships with members of their in-group. However, these relationships are less self-defining than are the corresponding relationships of those with more interdependent selves. I'm going to give you an example. It's going to probably make you a little bit upset. Males and females are different. Males are a lot more independent than females are, and females are a lot more interdependent than males are. So females tend to have fewer closer friends, and males tend to have a lot of not very close friends. The difference between independent and interdependent. Of course, this is an absolute. Not all males are the same, not all females are the same. But as a general thought, males are more independent, therefore they have lots more friends. They're not very close to those friends. Sometimes they don't even think of them as friends. But females tend to have a lot of, or fewer, really close friends. And this is one of the reasons when a man and a woman break up, the reaction is different, because a female will go to her really good friends, and they will all talk about what a jerk the guy is. And a man will go to the bar, and all of a sudden, all of these people are his friends, but since he's so independent, none of them are really close. Maybe he has a really close friend that comes to the bar and drinks with him. That's what happened when I broke up with my first wife. I had all of these people that were theoretically my friends, and they wanted me to go out and get drunk. What they wanted me to do, they wanted an excuse to go out and get drunk, is what they wanted. But I realized that, hey, this doesn't make any sense. Because I don't drink, for one thing. Interdependent selves identify more strongly with their in-group, while independent selves have a more permeable relationship. And the males are more permeable. That's why all of a sudden all these people became their friends. It would be difficult for a female to get into a situation where all these people suddenly became her friend. Easier for a man to do. Let me give you a quick example. I played softball on the reservation softball team when I was in Montana, and anybody that was on that team, even if they were my students, I assumed that we had a closer relationship than somebody who had never been on the softball team. So I thought of these people as my friends, the people I lift weights with. These are my friends. Well, they're not really my friends because we're just an in-group. We're just a select in-group. But strangely enough, I always thought of them as my friends, even though they probably didn't even notice that I was there. Because in-group relations are so critical for self-definition for people in more interdependent cultures, and because they serve to direct appropriate behaviors, it is especially necessary to identify those with whom one has such significant relationships. Obligations to others are an important part of in-group relations among interdependent people, so it is of vital importance for them to distinguish those toward whom they have obligations from those that they do not. So if you are a friend in an interdependent collectivist situation, then you are obliged to do things for them. If you're in an independent situation, you're not obliged to do things because you have a looser relationship with people. So if somebody asks you to help them move in an interdependent situation, then you would have to help them move. But if it was an independent situation, you could say, golly, I've got violin lessons. Yeah, I can't help you because I have to go to violin lessons. And that would be okay. That would be acceptable. Becoming a member of an interdependent individuals in-group is thus a rather substantial accomplishment, and such relationships should be entered cautiously, and of course they are. And this is something that I really have a difficult time recognizing. It was really difficult for me to become friends with people when I was in Saley because you guys tend to be more interdependent than independent. So while my idea is that I have all these friends, but I'm not very close to any of these people, it was a lot tougher for me to become people's friends, for them to accept me as their friends, because to be somebody's friend you have obligations that are completely alien to somebody that's independent. A more independent person is likely to perceive themselves as existing and functioning separately from the social environment. The environment is more tangential to the independent person's identity. Tangential means it's not important. Relationships can be formed and broken without having a large impact on the independent person's identity. So my identity doesn't really have, because I'm a more independent person, it really doesn't matter to me because I don't identify with these situations. Now it's really kind of interesting because I try not to join groups, and when I say groups, I don't join the VFW. I don't join the Democratic Party officially. I may vote Democrat, but I don't join the party because I don't want to be identified with a specific idea. I want to be independent. I want to be able to say no, that I don't like that. People with independent selves are more willing to form new relationships, maintain larger networks of relationships, and be less distressed should any of these relationships fade away over time. For independent persons, in-groups and out-groups are less consequential to self-construction. There is convergent evidence of heightened distinction between in-groups and out-groups among those who are more interdependent. Collectivistic cultures, like the Japanese, richly describe this pronounced difference in behavior between contexts involving in-groups, who are known as uchi, and those involving out-groups. Those are soto. And of course, I have a picture of young Japanese women all dressed in a similar fashion. I think this is the Sailor Moon outfit, at least it looks like from the caps that they're wearing. So theoretically, this is a group of Uchi. These are in-group people. These are Sailor Moon, people that dress like Sailor Moon. Are you impressed that I knew what Sailor Moon was? I don't really read anime or any of that other stuff. I just come across Sailor Moon from time to time, and I go, "Oh, so, okay, so a young lady dressed up like a sailor, that must be Sailor Moon." Okay. Studies have found that Asian Americans were more accurate than the European Americans in identifying emotions experienced by their close friends. Why? Because their close friends there's fewer of them, and of course they're around them all the time, and they have become part of their inner circle, and because of that, they're able to identify their emotions much more readily. European Americans who are more independent, more independent, and they have lots more friends, they were more accurate than Asian Americans in identifying emotions that were experienced by strangers. Why? Because they're used to seeing a lot of different people and identifying their emotions. Whereas a small group of individuals, it's very difficult for them to identify strangers' emotions because they really don't care. They only care about their in-group, this small core of people that they represent. This is according to Ma Kellums and Blaskovich in 2012. In places like Japan, where commitment to in-group members is strong, there should be less of a willingness to cooperate with outgoing members. People with interdependent selves focus their trust on people they share some kind of relationship with. Yamagishi and Yamagishi in 1994 found that Americans tend to have higher levels of general trust than the Japanese do. Why? Because the Japanese are more interdependent, they're more collectivistic, they have smaller groups. The smaller groups are tighter knit, and because they're tighter knit, they trust all the people in that small group. But if you're an outgroup member, then you don't know of those people. The only people you know are your in-group, the small core of people that you know. So you don't trust them because you don't know them. But Americans tend to have larger piles of friends. Therefore, we are more trusting than the Japanese are because we have all of these friends. Some of them are like this and some of them are like that. And they're still our friends because we have our friendships aren't as close. Therefore, it's easier for us to trust people because we interact more with our outgroup cohorts. Bond and Smith in 1996 found that people with more interdependent views of self are more likely to conform than those with more independent views. This may be because people with more interdependent selves view in-group members as an extension of themselves while maintaining distance from out-group members. So it's a lot easier for them to conform to the people that they're around than it is for people who are more independently minded. This is kind of an interesting picture. This is a picture of Japan used to be a closed society. They wouldn't let people in. They were an island. If somebody somebody who wasn't Japanese came to Japan, they killed them or they drove them away. They wouldn't let them land. But then in 1840, the United States Navy forced the Japanese to open their ports. And this is a picture of how they saw Americans. Japanese don't have that much hair, not nearly as much facial hair as Americans tend to have, especially white Americans. And what they almost saw a beast of a person, even his ears. I guess the Japanese also don't have their ears are attached, their earlobes are attached. Excuse me. And Americans, of course, a lot of white Americans have detached earlobes, and that's what this is all about. You can see the mean look on his face, and all the hair. He looks like some kind of a monster from outer space or something. And they probably saw us that way as Americans. Anyway, this is a picture of what Americans look like to the Japanese when we first landed, because we were so alien to them. can see, look at all the hair down here on his neck. Of course, they were sailors, and they had been sailing across the Pacific Ocean, so they were probably fairly hairy. They are correct. 1983, IBM tasked psychologist Gert Hofstede to assess their employees' opinions and interests. Hofstede is a psychologist from the Netherlands. Hofstede administered questionnaires to 117,000 employees of IBM that represented 40 different countries. Hofstede was able to map the individualism of all the employees in each country. The country scores show a clear and striking pattern, and you're going to be really shocked to find out who is more independent. The Hofstede discovered that the most individualistic country in the world is the United States, closely followed by other English-speaking countries and by Western European nations. Countries that scored high in collectivism were various nations in Latin America and Asia. Other research has found similar results. And of course, I have a picture of Kim Kardashian, a very individualistic individual, taking a selfie. I'm not sure. This was right after she had her baby, her last baby, I guess, if I remember correctly. Collectivism has been found to dominate in Asia, Africa, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and the South Pacific. Most people participate in collectivistic cultures where interdependent selves are more common. These countries encompass more than 80% of the world's population, which means that collectivism is prevalent in 80% of the population of the world, and independence is prevalent in only 20%. And that would be the United States, Canada, Australia, England, most of the Western countries, and Scandinavia. The state with the highest collectivism score by far was Hawaii, probably because of that state's large population of people with Asian ancestry. The next most collectivistic states were Utah and the states of the Confederate South. The least collectivistic states were in the Mountain West, the Great Plains, the Northeast, and the Midwest. Individualism varies as a function of social class. Specifically, people from higher socioeconomic backgrounds tend to have more independent selves than those from poorer backgrounds within the same country. Wealthier Icelandic children tend to describe themselves more in terms of inner psychological traits than poorer Icelandic children do. Now, these are actually children from Iceland. They are Scandinavian. Iceland was settled by Vikings, and they are very pale people. They tend to be very pale people anyway, with lots of blonde hair. Middle-class American parents emphasize the importance of self-direction to their children, whereas working-class American parents place greater value on conforming to authority figures. And this is according to Weininger and LaRue in 2009. Now, why would that be? Well, middle-class Americans, of course, can be more independent because potentially they don't have to rely on an authority figure for their job. But working-class Americans, working in factories, these individuals have to worry about keeping their job. The way that they survive is by keeping their job and working in the factory. Therefore, they would be more likely to accept what an authority figure says than a middle-class America. Let me give you an example. If you're a Trump aficionado, I apologize, but one of the reasons why working-class Americans seemed to have accepted Trump more is because he's very authoritarian. He tended to be autocratic. They didn't mind this. This didn't bother them at all because they like people telling them what to do. And of course, he was that person that told them to do the things that they wanted to do and to think the way that they wanted to think. Therefore, Trump became a hero for them. Interdependent messages are a better fit with American students from working class backgrounds. Some of the highest concentrations of universities in the United States are in the Northeast and the Midwest, where individualism is more pronounced. I went to one of these colleges, Wabash College in Indiana. Indiana has, what, 12 different colleges and universities. Actually, it has more than that. But they have a lot of small colleges. And the reason they have small colleges is because they are more independent minded, they are more individualistic. Wabash only has 875 students. That's fewer than Dene College has. But Wabash has been maintained this level of student body since I went there 55 years ago. 50, yeah, I started in 67. So what is that? It's 56 years. Psychological research within the United States has been largely conducted with participants who are even more individualistic than most other Americans because they went to colleges in the Midwest or the Northeast. So if you look at the Midwest and the Northeast, you see a lot of small colleges. You see a lot of the Big Ten, for example. Gee, many Christmas. It has Penn State and Rutgers and Maryland and Iowa and Indiana and Purdue and Michigan State and Northwestern and Illinois, Wisconsin and Minnesota. But if you look at the number of small colleges in those states, there are 20, 30 colleges. Pennsylvania, New York, New Hampshire, Vermont, all of the Northeast, and all of the Midwest, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, just tons and tons of these small independent colleges. Why? Because people in the Northeast and the Midwest are more individualistic. That's what they're looking for. So because I went to Wabash, and Wabash tends to have not too bad a football team, I watch Division III football. And Division III football has over half of the schools in the United States are Division III. Why would that be? Well, it's because they're small colleges, and the Northeast and the Midwest has a lot of them. Now, how many Division III colleges are in Arizona and New Mexico? The answer is 0 in both states. California has like 3. Oregon has 2 or 3. Washington has 4 or 5. Oklahoma has 0. Nebraska has 2 or 3. Iowa has like 5 or 6. Indiana has like 20. Okay, so what we're talking about is a lot of really small liberal arts colleges. And of course, that's my background as well. Other cultural dimensions that researchers have investigated include societal tightness versus looseness. Societal tightness characterizes how strong cultural norms are and how tolerant cultures are of deviant behavior. This predicts level of prevention focus, impulse control, and self-regulation. Another cultural dimension that has been investigated are cultural values. Values for universalism, benevolence, conformity, tradition, security, power, achievement, hedonism. Hedonism has to do with doing things that make you feel good. Stimulation, self-direction. Other cultural dimensions that have been investigated: power distance, uncertainty, avoidance, vertical horizontal social structure, relationship structure, context dependence, social cynicism, and complexity. One of the difficulties in studying cultural psychology is that individuals tend to be varied and complex. Cultures are highly variable and are resistant to categorization. All cultures are highly heterogeneous and contain a great variety of people. Cultural differences this book describes reflect general patterns of differences and not all or nothing statements. Now, this is true of a lot of different places. If you go to Japan, 95% of the people in Japan are Japanese. It's a very homogeneous country. In the United States, once upon a time, the vast majority of people in the United States were white, but it's only around 70% now. That means, we have 15% African American, we have 15, and we must have less because we have 13% Hispanic, and we have like 2 or 3% American Indian. But once upon a time, and that's one of the reasons why there are so many people out there screaming white power and that white people need to take over, and we need to change the laws so that we get more white representation. The reality is that the United States is a very heterogeneous country. It's far more heterogeneous than just about any place. So our culture is very heterogeneous, far more so than just about any place else in any place else in the world. And that's one of the reasons why we have the problems that we have. And that's one of the reasons why when Donald Trump supported this, people who are white taking over everything, why there were so many people that supported that. As weird as that may seem. If this were in Japan, there would be no argument because 95% of the population is the same. They're all Japanese. And the other 5% are gaijin, people from someplace else. But in the United States, we're far more heterogeneous. And that's one of the reasons why we're having this assault on democracy right now. And it's, of course, one of the things that we need to make sure that we support democracy. We need to support the heterogeneity, because if the other side takes over, if we become more autocratic, it's going to be bad for people that aren't white. It's also going to be bad for people who are white but don't support that type of an idea. So politically, this is a really dangerous time in the United States. The election was stolen. What are they talking about? A number of researchers have identified women as more interdependent than men, and that's why I said that earlier. The features of independent entities seem more characteristic of men than of women. There are issues of gender equality in most cultures, including the Muslim cultures and Western cultures. Women represent only about 3% of elected officials in Arab nations. Women represent 45% of the Swedish parliament. In Brazil, 50% of the men and women are literate. In Pakistan, twice as many men are literate as women. And of course, this has become an issue since we pulled out of Afghanistan. The idea was when the Taliban had controlled Afghanistan, they wouldn't allow, because of their religion, they wouldn't allow women to go to school. Therefore, they were illiterate. They didn't learn to read. And now that we have pulled out again, now that we're not there anymore, there is a fear that they will go back to their old ways. And of course, this is the way it is in Pakistan. It is traditionally you do not educate women in Muslim countries, so this is acceptable behavior in that part of the world. In the Netherlands, Germany, and Finland, on the average, people express views that men and women should be treated quite similarly. In India, Pakistan, and Nigeria, people tended to believe that roles, obligations, and rights of men and women are clearly different, with men being perceived to have more rights than women. And this was in India, Pakistan, and Nigeria. I have a friend from Bangladesh. When he first came to the United States, it was really difficult for him to accept the independence of women in the United States. Bangladesh used to be East Pakistan. It used to be part of Pakistan. It's a Muslim country. He had to shift gears in his brain because he had been raised for like 25 years. He'd been raised that women should be subservient to men. But when he came to the United States, that wasn't the way it was. And one of the reasons that we talked so often, this was at Ashford, one of the reasons we talked so often was because he was trying to deal with this. And he wanted to stay in the United States. He wanted to become a college professor and stay in the United States. But he knew unless he changed the way that he saw the world, that he would not be able to accept the differences between his country and uh, and his way of treating women and uh, and the United States. He needed to shift gears in his brain. He's teaching at University of Minnesota Duluth. He's looking for another job, and I hope that he has that this has taken place. But he called me last week because he was so depressed that people weren't offering him work, and of course I explained to him, you can be the best teacher in the world, and and they're not going to know it from looking at your resume. You have to show them this. So it was really kind of interesting. He's okay. He'll be fine, and potentially he'll marry an American instead of try to find somebody from Bangladesh. We've had that conversation before. I said, well, my goodness, you seem to have trouble with women in the United States because they're so independent and they're so forthright. Maybe you should marry somebody from Bangladesh. And he had to go back to Bangladesh. He lost his student visa, and he lost his green card. He had to go back to Bangladesh, and he said they're so backward. The people in Bangladesh are so backward, and the women are so needy. He said he liked women in the United States because they do things for themselves. In Bangladesh, they just sit and wait for men to do things for them. It was a very different culture and a very different situation. Within a culture, men and women tended to share fairly similar views about gender equality. In India, Pakistan, and Nigeria, women tended to embrace the gender attitudes of their respective countries. And actually, in the United States in the 1950s, it was not as extreme as it is in India, Pakistan, and Nigeria today. But if you look at my sister's yearbook, they would always say what the people wanted to do. And the men, of course, wanted to be farmers, and they wanted to work in factories, and they wanted to make $1 million. And the women wanted to get married and have children and be the best wife that they possibly could be. This was in their yearbooks back in the 1950s and 1960s. A little bit shocking for us today because things have changed. Women have gone so much farther. My sister actually was a feminist, and she was in the forefront of the feminist movement back in the 70s to change all that. They were trying to force women to stay at home and make children and be homemakers, and that's all they wanted to do, and that's all they needed to do. And of course, the attitude changed, and the way it changed was the feminist movement in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s. There was a huge upheaval going on in the United States in the 60s and 70s. Civil rights, anti-war, and the feminist movement, they all just exploded society and forced people to change the way that they think. In every case except two reversals in Malaysia and Pakistan, males have a significantly more traditional gender view than females tend to have, probably because traditional gender views benefit men more than women. And this is an old advertisement from the 1950s. As you can see, show her it's a man's world. They're talking about Van Heusen ties and shirts. And here she is on her knees, and she's serving her husband breakfast in bed, and he's all dressed up. Is this the craziest thing you ever saw? Well, sure. If this advertisement was in a magazine today, then they'd probably burn down the building. Countries in which a large percentage of the population practiced Christianity, in particular Protestantism, were more likely to have egalitarian gender views, whereas countries with a large percentage of Muslims were associated with more traditional gender views. So Protestantism, which really is not that strong any place except in the Netherlands, in Scandinavia, Let's see, where else is it? England is not Protestant. Well, it is Protestant, but it's a more um, it's a more extreme form of Protestantism. It's a lot closer to Catholicism than to American Protestantism. Anyway, so the more Protestant a country is, the less the more egalitarian it is. The more Muslim it is, the more traditional the gender views. And the United States, of course, is the vast majority of people in the United States are some form of Protestant. Catholic religion is very popular in the United States, but it's still a minority in the United States. Oddly, more northern countries express more egalitarian views, and more southern countries express more traditional gender views. The more urbanized the country, the more likely the country will have egalitarian views. A country's individualism score correlated positively with egalitarian views. And of course, we have Russia, where more than half the doctors are female. We have Scandinavian and Western Europe. We have the United States and Canada, of course, and then Africa and South Asia, China and India and Indonesia. These are all Muslim countries, mostly Muslim countries. One way to look at gender and culture is to determine which gender identity is viewed to be more essentialized, which gender is thought to reflect an underlying unchangeable essence, which gender has less flexible ways of being expressed in a socially approved way. Now, if we're looking at the United States, we could look at people's clothes and we could say, let's see, we have a classroom full of males and females, and everybody's wearing jeans. Now, is that more masculine or is that more feminine? Let's think about this for a second. We have, okay, well, let's just use the jeans as an example. How often do you see somebody wearing a dress? Not very often. Okay, but we see all of these men. None of the men are wearing dresses, certainly, and only some of the women, a minority of the women, are wearing skirts or dresses. Okay, so which is more essentialized? Well, in the United States, it's the male gender that is more essentialized. Americans tend to view male gender identity to be more essentialized than female gender identity. Most Americans do not seem to find it disturbing or unusual for women to present themselves like men, wearing pants, having short hair, not wearing facial makeup, or participating in stereotypically male behaviors, girls playing with trucks or girls playing ice hockey. How weird does this look? Does this look weirder than a woman wearing pants and a flannel shirt? Which looks weirder, a woman playing hockey or a man wearing a dress? And I hope you're saying that a man wearing a dress looks weirder than a woman playing hockey, because women do play hockey, of course. Many Americans do find it disturbing or unusual for men to present themselves as women, wearing dresses, high heels, or lipstick, or to participate in stereotypically female behaviors such as playing with dolls or taking ballet lessons. Male identity is less changeable and thus more essentialized. In Hindu myths, many more male gods change into female goddesses than female goddesses change into gods. The Hindu religion involves goddess worship, and many of the most powerful gods are female, such as Kali, Parvati, Durga, and Maya. According to the Hindu religion, female identity is viewed as pure, strong, and powerful. In India, the male gender identity was more mutable and less essentialized than the female gender. And this is one of the reasons why when Westerners came to India, they had a far more difficult time than when they went to someplace that where the male gender was more essentialized. This is what Kali looks like, and of course she's the many-armed goddess. And there's Parvati, she's a four-armed goddess. And there's Durga, she has many arms as well. and Maya. She's another four-armed goddess. Festinger in 1957 proposed that people have a powerful motivation to be consistent, and their cognitive dissonance is the distressing feeling we have when we observe ourselves acting inconsistently. The belief that we can easily change and are expected to change is referred to as an incremental theory of self. Traits are malleable and can be improved. Aspects of the self are largely resistant to change, which is known as an entity theory of self. Individuals with this view see their attributes to be largely inborn. There are two views children have of intelligence. This is the way my intelligence is. I'm a rock. No, intelligence will grow and develop, and that's two ways of seeing things. Research found that 60% of the Chinese high school students said that the key to success in math is to study hard. In contrast, less than 25% of American high school students felt this way, that they could improve their math scores by studying hard. Japanese believe more than Americans that intelligence is based on how hard you try rather than on what they are born with. To get into a good American university, you typically need to get an acceptable score on the SAT test, or the SAT. The SAT was originally designed to measure innate aptitudes and not efforts in one's classes. It turns out that studying hard can increase one's SAT score significantly. This has been a source of frustration for test makers, psychometricians, because the tests are no longer serving the function they were originally designed for, which has sparked much policy debate about their utility. You can also raise your IQ score. You can raise your SAT score. This isn't what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to show your innate ability. And that's the reason they use the SAT score. If you had a low grade point average in high school, but you had a high SAT score, it showed that you had the innate ability to learn things. So you might be more likely to be accepted in a college. Now, I started college in 1967. And I was talking to my brother about this. I landed right in the middle of my class. I was like 22nd. I had the 22nd highest GPA in my high school class out of 72. But my SAT score was high and my IQ score was high. So when I applied to an elite college, they threw out my grade point average. They threw out my place in my high school, and they accepted my SAT score and my IQ score. Strangely enough, I had never been told that my IQ score was high. Sorry about the dog. I was never told that my IQ score was high, so I didn't think I was that smart. I knew my SAT scores were pretty good. Anyway, IQ tests are regularly given in public schools in the United States, and the results influence decisions on whether students should attend gifted or remedial classes. In Japan, to get into a good university, you need to do well on university entrance exams that test your mastery of a large amount of material. So the Japanese go to mentoring classes practically every night. So not only do they go to school for 8 hours a day, but after school, they go to these mentoring classes to make sure that they will do well on these university entrance exams. The Japanese bar exam to become a lawyer is notoriously difficult. Only 2.5% of people pass it every year. And that means that of 200 people who take the test, only 5 will pass. And of those who do, on average, have failed the exam 4 times before ultimately succeeding. So and you can only take it once a year. So if you have gone to law school in Japan, the probability of you passing it the first year is only 2.5%. And you'll probably have to take it at least 4 times before you pass. Approximately 2/3 of those taking the American bar exam each year pass it, with about 3/4 of them passing it on their first attempt. So that's 66% compared to 2.5%. The five-factor model of personality started as a personality profile test developed to test U.S. Air Force officers in the 1950s by two researchers at the RAND Corporation named Tupis and Crystal. And this was in 1961 when they first published this. They came up with the five-factor model in the early 1950s. Now, the United States, the Air Force became a separate entity. It used to be part of the Army. Became a separate entity in 1948. So it was, they were trying they needed to tell the difference between an Army officer and an Air Force officer. So they looked at different factors. Army men, the Army officers deal with a lot of men on a lot of different situations. But the Air Force officers, they were kind of separate from the enlisted personnel. They didn't really have to boss them around. There were only select officers that needed to boss them around. However, Air Force officers fly airplanes. All of the pilots are officers. Therefore, they needed to find men who had the wherewithal, the personality to be able to fly airplanes at a very rapid speed and to be able to handle the stress of air flight as compared to the Army officers that needed to boss men around on a frequent basis. Tupis and Crystal used factor analysis to determine which of Cattell's 16 personality factors were significant. Cattell came up with 16 personality factors that were the most important factors in developing somebody's personality. This is Tupis, I think. This picture is Tupis. I couldn't find a picture of Crystal. They came up with five that factored as most important over and over again, and this is for the United States Air Force. So when we're talking about the five-factor model of personality, we're talking about a five-factor model that was determined right after World War II, during the Korean War, and it wasn't published until 1961. And we're talking about the difference between the Air Force and the Army. And here's Cattell's 16 personality factors: warmth, reasoning, emotional stability, dominance, liveliness, rule consciousness, social boldness, sensitivity, vigilance, attractiveness, abstractedness, privateness, apprehension, openness to change, self-reliance, perfectionism, and tension. And through their research, Tupis and Crystal came up with five. These are the five most important things for Air Force officers. These are the five most important personality traits for Air Force officers to have. Okay, and here are the five: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And actually, we're looking for the opposite of neuroticism. Openness to experience reflects a person's intelligence and curiosity about the world. Conscientiousness indicates how responsible and dependable an individual is. Extroversion indicates how much an individual is active and dominant. Agreeableness is the extent to which a person tends to be warm and pleasant, and neuroticism is the degree to which an individual can be seen as emotionally stable and unpredictable. Now, what they were looking for was the opposite of neuroticism, of course. They needed to be emotionally stable and predictable. They needed to be agreeable, they needed to be extroverted, they needed to be conscientious, and they needed to be open to experience. Why open to experience? Because military personnel move around a lot. And I can tell you, I think, wait a minute, let me think. I was in the Air Force for 12 years, and I moved, I started in San Antonio, Texas, then went to Wichita Falls, Texas, then to Dayton, Ohio, then to Lubbock, Texas, then to Germany, then to Offutt in Bellevue, Nebraska. Okay, so I moved 6 times in 12 years. Right, moved 6 times. And of course, I went TDY various times. TDY means temporary duty assignments. I moved 6 times. My wife, who was in for 24 years, started off in Wichita Falls, Texas. Then she went to Lubbock, Texas. Then she went to Germany. Then she went to Omaha, Nebraska. Then she went from Omaha, she went to Peru, Indiana. Then from Peru, she went back to Omaha. From Omaha, she went to March Air Force Base in California. From March, she came back to Offutt in Omaha, Nebraska. From Omaha, where did we go? She went back to Peru, Indiana. Then she went to where did she go from Peru? She went to Korea. Then from Korea, she went to Japan. From Japan, she went to Oklahoma, Tinker Air Force Base. From Tinker, she went out to California, March Air Force Base in Riverside. Then she went to Mississippi. Then from Mississippi, she went to Washington, D.C., and then back to okay, so anyway, you get to move around a lot. So you need to be open to experience. And I'll tell you, the difference between Mississippi and Nebraska is like night and day. Excuse me. And of course, Washington, D.C. is never a lot of fun. Well, I didn't find it that way. Some people like Washington. Anyway, so you get to move around a lot. The 5-factor model proposes that all personality traits largely reflect some combination of these 5 core traits. All personality traits should show significant correlations with at least one, if not more, of these core traits. The 5 factors can be seen to reflect the basic structure of our personalities. There is a question as to how well the 5-factor structure generalizes elsewhere. And why is that? Because the 5-factor model was developed as an Air Force personality test. They were looking for good Air Force officers. They weren't looking for good airmen. They weren't looking for good Army officers. Marines are different than the Air Force. The Navy is different than the Air Force. They were looking for good Air Force officers. An analysis of indigenous Chinese personality traits found a set of factors that were not the same as the Big 5. Rather, 4 factors emerged that were captured by the following labels. Okay, so the Chinese, when they looked at the Big 5, they found out, this doesn't fit. Well, that makes sense because, these are supposed to be U.S. Air Force officers, not Chinese anything. So when the Chinese looked at the Big 5, they found that they had 4 that were more important than the Big 5. One was dependability, reflecting responsibility, optimism, and trustworthiness. Interpersonal relatedness, reflecting harmony, thrift, relational orientation, and tradition. Social potency, reflecting leadership, adventurousness, and extroversion. And individualism, reflecting logical orientation, defensiveness, and self-orientation. Why? Because the Chinese are a collectivist country, and they want their people to their personality to be different than people in the United States, and especially people in the United States military. Similar approaches have been taken in other cultures. Researchers looking at Filipino personality traits discovered 2 additional traits to the Big 5. One was temperamentalness, as interesting as that is, and the other is negative valence dimension. In other words, they wanted their leaders to be temperamental, and they wanted their leaders to see people that were different as negative. And so they wanted their leaders to be completely different than the leaders in the United States, especially in the Air Force. They wanted their leaders to be temperamental, and they needed them to see people that were different from them as negative. How about that? Isn't that curious? And we're talking about different cultures here. In an investigation of 11 different language groups in South Africa revealed 9 underlying factors, some of which overlapped with the big 5, but the other factors that did not: integrity and relationship harmony. And of course, South Africa is a South African, therefore they are not only uh, black Africans, but they are also white Africans as well. So relationship harmony was very important to them. Some studies in other languages reveal evidence for factors in addition to the big 5. Other studies sometimes do not find evidence for all 5 of the big 5 traits. In particular, openness to experience is the trait that emerges the least consistently in studies conducted in other languages. So if you live in Romania, then you would want to live in Romania. One of the interesting things about people in the United States is that the vast majority of people in the United States are not Native American. In other words, they're not native to this country. They had to move from one place to another. They needed to move from Europe or wherever to the United States. Now, people that stayed in Europe, people that are from Romania, their ancestors go back in Romania thousands of years. The same way with England, the same thing with France, same thing with Germany and Hungary and all of the European countries. So openness to experience, this idea that people are wanderers, is very common in the United States, but it's not very common in other places, like in Romania. This is the Romanian flag, by the way. And that's very logical. So people that have immigrated to the United States are people who have wandered from Europe to here. And a lot of times it was only 2 or 3 generations ago. So Americans are big in moving. So if you live in Chicago and you're looking for a job, then you may find a job in Arizona, or you may find a job in New York City, or you may find a job in Florida. And we are willing to do that. But if were Romanian, we would have to live in the same spot for an extended length of time. And that may be one of the differences between American Indians, Native Americans, the indigenous peoples of the Americas, and all of these immigrant people with this strange idea that they need to be open to experience. They have this wander gene in their DNA. So that's one of the things that you need to remember about us wanderers, us non-American Indians, us non-Native Americans, us non-indigenous people, is the fact that we still have this wander gene, and it comes out all the time. So we don't have to live in Texas for 12 or 13 generations. We don't have to live in, well, I'm from Indiana. Why am I not in Indiana? And the answer is because why, why did I move 6 times in the Air Force and then 9 times with my wife? Why? Because I have this wandering gene and I'm willing to pick up roots and move. One of the reasons I lost my job up in Montana is because they were trying to force me to do something, and I said, "You're not going to force me to do anything. I would rather quit and go someplace else than stay here and be treated this way." And that's exactly what happened. They said, "Okay, you're gone," and I said, "Okay, don't worry about it. I'll find another job," which I did. I found another job, and now I'm here in Saline, or I'm not actually in Saline, but I'm in Iowa. And my people live in Indiana, and that's okay. They can live in Indiana. I would rather live in the middle of a cornfield in Iowa, as weird as that sounds. You guys should understand this because the Dene people seem to live accept isolation. So you live out. You don't have to live close to other people. So, that's one of the reasons why I can identify with the Dene people, as well as I can, because I don't want to live that close to people either, especially my relatives. The north central Great Plains, especially around Minnesota and Wisconsin, is the epicenter for the friendly and conventional cluster. Minnesota and Wisconsin. Here you go. Iowa's right underneath it. This is the friendly and conventional cluster, as residents are the highest in the country for the traits of extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. And if you've ever been to Wisconsin, and Dr. Russ is from Wisconsin, so this is maybe one of the reasons why Dr. Russ is such a friendly person, because she's from Wisconsin, where they're friendly and conventional, and they have traits of extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. The western states from Oregon down to Arizona house the relaxed and creative cluster, where there is the lowest neuroticism and the highest openness to experience. The northeastern states, especially New York and Massachusetts, are home to the temperamental and uninhibited cluster, where people score the highest on neuroticism and the lowest in conscientiousness. And this is one of the reasons why if you go to New York City and you ask somebody for help, they probably won't give it to you. But if you're in Iowa and you need help, the other day we saw this couple walking along the road. We saw that their car was stopped. They had run out of gas, and here so we stopped and I took them to the gas station, and I took my wife where she needed to go, and then I took them back to their car, and it's conscientious. And that's the end of the chapter. Fun chapter. Had a good time. Thank you. I hope I didn't offend anybody, though I always say that at the end of the chapter. If I did, I apologize, because I'm from here. There we go. I live right here right now, and I'm from here. I've lived all over the place, and I I understand. Okay. Anyway, I don't understand. I just know what I've experienced. So I'll see you guys next week. Next week is chapter 7. We're getting close to midterm, aren't we?